For 30 years, Johnny Carson was America's nightly companion, and then he vanished so completely that even the National Broadcasting Company couldn't lure him back for their 75th anniversary. What looked like a simple retirement was actually a meticulously engineered disappearance, built on 5 hidden reasons Carson never wanted you to know. The most private public man who ever lived. For 30 years, Americans invited Johnny Carson into their homes every weeknight. He was there when you brushed your teeth, folded laundry, crawled into bed. People felt they knew him the way you know a neighbor you see every day, or a family member whose voice drifts down the hallway after you've fallen asleep. But the people who truly knew Johnny Carson, his family, his few close friends, understood something the public never did. The warm, witty host America adored once compared his own mother to Lady Macbeth. Ruth Carson was not the doting Midwestern mom the public might have imagined. She was ice. When 10-year-old Johnny won his school talent show, he raced home, glowing. He'd made kids laugh. He'd been chosen. He'd felt seen. Ruth's response? Your tie was crooked. No, I'm proud of you. No hug. Just an assessment and a negative one. At 14, Johnny landed his first radio job, an astonishing achievement for a small-town kid in the 1940s. He came home excited, expecting recognition. Why aren't you on television? She asked. Television was barely a thing. But for Ruth, whatever Johnny achieved only highlighted what he hadn't done yet. The finish line always moved. Nothing was enough. Even after he became Johnny Carson, her responses stayed the same. One Christmas, after he was a national star, he bought her an expensive, elegant coat. High-end, tasteful, chosen with care. She never wore it. Not my style, she said, and that was that. Decades later, when Carson privately compared his mother to Lady Macbeth, it wasn't a joke. Shakespeare's most chilling woman actively numbs her own conscience to pursue power. For Johnny to reach for that reference suggests his wounds were far deeper than simple Midwestern reserve. Ruth offered emotional distance where other mothers offered warmth. She offered criticism where others offered encouragement. With her, love felt like a test he kept failing. So Johnny adapted. He learned that his authentic self wasn't acceptable. If he wanted connection, he had to perform his way into people's good graces. Charm them, entertain them, control how they saw him. The strategy worked so well, it became indistinguishable from his identity. On camera, Johnny was charming, relaxed, always ready with a joke. He seemed like the kind of man who'd be easy to talk to in line at the supermarket or at a backyard barbecue. In reality, he was exactly the opposite. His makeup artist once came to his dressing room after a show. The door was slightly open. Inside, Johnny sat in the dark, still in his immaculate suit, staring into space. No television, no music, just silence. She gently asked, "Johnny, are you?" He raised one finger. "Not now." She backed away and closed the door. She would later say this wasn't occasional. It was ritual. After nearly every show, he needed an hour alone in the dark to recover from what he'd just done on stage, overriding his nature, projecting warmth he didn't feel, sustaining conversation when he desperately craved silence. Johnny's own brother Dick admitted publicly, "Johnny and I were never close. Even as kids, I didn't know him." Imagine that. You grow up in the same house, eat at the same table, share the same parents, and decades later you can say you didn't know your own brother. Carson used humor the way some people use sunglasses protection. Jokes weren't an open window into his personality. They were a mirrored surface. You saw what he chose to show you, and he saw out while remaining unseen. The Tonight Show forced him to perform extroversion 5 nights a week. The show required him to be interested when he was bored, empathetic when he felt numb, warm when his default setting was cool reserve. For 30 years, he did it so flawlessly that the audience believed the persona was the person. But privately, Carson could imagine something terrifying. A world where that performance never ended, where he'd be dragged on stage again and again as the older, slower version of himself, while younger hosts danced and shouted and high-fived their way into the future. That future was already arriving. In 1988, Carson sat in his Malibu home watching Arsenio Hall tear up the 18 to 34 demographic. Hall bounced across the stage, hyped up the crowd, signaled directly to black viewers who'd never seen themselves directly courted like this in late night. Carson turned to his longtime producer, Fred De Cordova, and said words that would echo through his retirement. "Fred, watch this kid. He's the future, and the future doesn't need me." 2 years later, in 1990, Cable news network's 24-hour cable news model got approval. Carson understood what that really meant. Soon, there would be no single place where America gathered each night, no shared monoculture. Everyone would pick their own channel, their own echo chamber. The country that made Johnny Carson possible, a country where nearly everyone watched the same thing at 11:30 p.m., was disappearing. He told his wife, Alex, "I'm getting out before they figure out I'm obsolete." For most performers, that would have been a terrifying thought. For Johnny Carson, it was liberating. Retirement meant he could finally stop pretending. He structured his days around solitude. Invitations to parties, charity events, tribute nights, they were declined with near total consistency. If he could have arranged it, he might have declined the mail. He preferred a small poker game with a handful of trusted friends. These were people who understood that his quiet wasn't a snub, it was self-preservation. They didn't demand stories or constantly ask for the old days. They let him be. The rest of his time he filled with solitary obsessions. Astronomy. He'd spend hours alone with his telescopes, looking at something that didn't need him to be funny. Magic. The art form built entirely on misdirection and concealment. The real work of a magician happens where you're not looking. The real self is always hidden behind the trick. Is it any wonder the greatest late-night host of all time was drawn to an art built on secrets? The gregarious host Americans thought they knew was, in reality, the most private public man of his generation. For 3 decades, the country watched a nightly illusion, an introvert performing extroversion so convincingly that the mask outlived the man. You laughed with someone who was never really there. That illusion, built on a childhood wound and maintained for 50 years, would become the foundation for the greatest celebrity disappearance in modern history. That's reason 1, Johnny Carson vanished, an extreme introversion forged by a cold mother who taught him to hide. But there was another force waiting in the wings, one that would turn his instinct for disappearance into a permanent exile. The National Broadcasting Company was about to betray him, the heir apparent who never was. By the early 1990s, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson wasn't just a hit, it was the National Broadcasting Company's golden goose, printing money with machine-like regularity. 17% of everything the National Broadcasting Company earned came from 90 minutes of programming, 5 nights a week anchored by one man. When sitcoms flopped, Carson absorbed the losses. When expensive dramas fizzled, Carson's ad revenue smoothed the books. The National Broadcasting Company could fail in almost every other primetime slot and still remain profitable as long as Johnny was there at 11:30. So when Johnny announced he was retiring, one question terrified the network. Who gets the throne? Carson made his answer clear: David Letterman. Letterman had been sharpened in the post-Tonight Show slot, 12:30 a.m., for nearly a decade. His late-night show had developed a cult following top 10 lists, absurd bits, ironic distance. Letterman was stranger and more subversive than Carson, but that was the point. He was evolution, not imitation. Carson saw in Letterman the same thing the National Broadcasting Company once saw in him: hungry, inventive, and fearless about pushing the format. Letterman was already the National Broadcasting Company property, beloved by younger viewers. Most crucially, he had Carson's explicit blessing. After 30 years, Johnny assumed he'd earned at least that, enough trust that his vision for The Tonight Show's future would carry weight. It didn't. Behind closed doors, the National Broadcasting Company was changing. The executives who'd come up with Johnny, the men who saw him as the network's heartbeat, were either retiring or being quietly pushed aside. A new leadership class had arrived, obsessed with demographics, youth skew, and not rocking the affiliate boat. Those executives were nervous about David Letterman. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also edgy, ironic, sometimes prickly. Affiliates weren't sure if Middle America would embrace him at 11:30 the way New York and college kids did at 12:30. Jay Leno, on the other hand, felt safe. Leno had spent years as Carson's frequent guest host. He was already familiar to audiences. His act was broad and apolitical jokes about headlines, everyday life, mild celebrity ribbing. He was friendly to affiliates, deferential to executives, and, crucially, willing to play ball. In 1991, a series of leaks, power plays, and backroom maneuvers culminated in a single announcement. Jay Leno would replace Johnny Carson as host of The Tonight Show. David Letterman was out. The decision broke in the trade papers on a Tuesday morning. For the National Broadcasting Company, it was a strategic business call. For Carson, it was a wake-up call. He'd given the network 30 years. He'd made them billions. His face had been the prime-time safety net. And when he spoke up about the one decision that mattered most to him, the future of his chair, they treated his opinion like a suggestion from an outgoing employee. The message, as Carson heard it, was devastatingly clear. Your value ends when your contract does. This wasn't rejection by an individual. It was rejection by the institution he'd carried on his back. Carson didn't scream. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't publicly humiliate the National Broadcasting Company or Jay Leno. He did something worse. He silently walked away. After that, Johnny rejected nearly every The National Broadcasting Company outreach. Anniversary specials? No. Tribute packages? No. Appearances on Leno's Tonight Show? Absolutely not. He became a ghost on the network he'd once defined. And then he pulled off one of the quietest, sharpest acts of revenge in Hollywood history. In retirement, every so often, David Letterman would receive a fax. Plain paper, typed jokes, no signature. But the voice was unmistakable. Johnny Carson was sending monologue jokes to David Letterman, now the host of The Late Show on Columbia Broadcasting System. Letterman began using some of them on air, letting the lines speak for themselves. Carson had picked his air, and it wasn't the man occupying his old chair. He was continuing to feed jokes to the show that should have been his Tonight Show successor on a rival network. The faxes were never advertised while Johnny was alive. Letterman understood Carson's need for secrecy and respected it completely. But inside the industry, word trickled out. Carson was writing for Letterman. Letterman would confirm it publicly only after Carson's passing. But by then, the symbolic meaning was clear. Carson's creative loyalty had shifted from the National Broadcasting Company to the man the National Broadcasting Company had passed over. There was another detail, whispered for years and later corroborated by people close to Leno. In 13 years of retirement, Carson never watched a full episode of Jay Leno hosting The Tonight Show. Not one. He didn't call to congratulate him. He didn't offer advice. He didn't discuss the show in interviews because he didn't do interviews. The man who'd made The Tonight Show a national institution refused even to witness what the National Broadcasting Company had turned it into without him. For a public figure as private as Carson, cutting off the network that made him famous didn't require effort. Their relationship had always been transactional. They gave him airtime. He made them money. Once the transaction ended, so did the bond. That's reason 2 Johnny Carson vanished. Institutional betrayal. The moment the National Broadcasting Company showed him his judgment didn't matter, he removed the only remaining tether he had to Hollywood. But that betrayal didn't just confirm his distance from the National Broadcasting Company. It reinforced a philosophy he'd already been cultivating, a philosophy he would push to its absolute extreme. If these revelations about Johnny Carson's hidden life are changing how you remember him, subscribe to Golden Age Files. We uncover the carefully guarded truths behind the stars you grew up, watching the stories they never wanted you to know. Because Johnny Carson wasn't just escaping the National Broadcasting Company. He was about to prove he believed something almost no other star is willing to accept. That the only way to be remembered at your best is to never let anyone see you again. The student of the Zenith, Johnny Carson didn't just retire. He executed an exit strategy so absolute, so disciplined, that it turned withdrawal into an art form. The roots of that strategy stretch back to his predecessor, Jack Paar. Paar had hosted The Tonight Show before Carson and endured a messy, emotional final year. On-air walkouts, rants, visible exhaustion, the audience watched a man unravel in real time. The show went from must-see television to an uncomfortable spectacle. Fred de Cordova, Carson's longtime producer, later said that Johnny watched every second and drew a harsh lesson: never let them see you decline. When Carson finally left The Tonight Show in 1992, after 4,531 episodes, most viewers assumed he'd follow the well-trodden celebrity path. Occasional talk show appearances, a memoir, quietly accepting awards, sitting in the front row at tribute nights as younger stars thanked him for paving the way. Carson had a different religion, the religion of the zenith. He believed that once you've had a career-defining first act, any second act in the same arena can only be smaller. Every comeback, every television appearance becomes an unflattering comparison point. The equation in his mind was simple. More appearances equals more chances to look diminished. He saw what happened to his contemporaries, once feared comedians showing up as grateful guests on younger hosts' couches, once commanding actors gamely playing along in cheesy sketches written for them out of obligation. The legend shrank each time they said yes. Carson refused. Fred de Cordova put it this way: Johnny believed he'd done it. Anything after that would be a diluted echo, not an encore. The National Broadcasting Company didn't understand how serious he was. 6 years after Carson's farewell, in 1998, the National Broadcasting Company decided it was time to bring him back, just once, in triumph. They sent a senior producer to Carson's Malibu home armed with a leather-bound proposal, a 1-hour primetime special celebrating Johnny Carson's legacy. The offer was everything a retired star could want. Total creative control, freedom to design the format, a blank check. The producer sat with Johnny on his terrace, the Pacific glittering below, and laid it all out. America misses you. We'll do it your way, one night only. It will be a love letter. Carson listened politely. Then he said the quiet, ruthless truth out loud. If I do this special, it becomes the thing people remember. Not 30 years of shows, 1 hour where I'm older, slower, not quite as sharp. That's what gets frozen in memory. That becomes Johnny Carson, the producer argued. He insisted the country would see it as a celebration, not a comparison. That the affection would override any awareness of age. Carson didn't debate. He just stood up. The meeting was over. There would be no special. The National Broadcasting Company kept trying. They pleaded with him to appear in their 75th anniversary celebration. Just a quick segment, just a wave from the audience, just a nod from the man who'd built the house. He declined. He refused to participate in any event that turned him into what he contemptuously called a public nostalgia act. That phrase is telling. Not legend, not icon. An act, a routine. Something trotted out when the present has nothing left to offer. His resolve was tested again and again. Each time, he said no. Then came a moment that would have broken almost anyone else professionally and personally. In June 1991, as he was nearing his retirement announcement, the National Broadcasting Company's decision about his successor deeply wounded him. But in 1995, he faced something infinitely worse. His son, Richard, lost his life in a car accident at age 39. The media sensed an emotional opportunity. Every major outlet wanted the exclusive grief interview, the Johnny Carson opens up about loss special. Barbara Walters personally reached out. Carson's answer was silence. No carefully worded statement through a publicist, no respect our privacy press release. Nothing. At Richard's funeral, photographers hid in the trees with long lenses, waiting to capture the great man brought low by tragedy. Carson spotted them. He got in his car and left his own son's service rather than give them the shot. He would not let his private agony become public entertainment. The wall held through triumph and through unthinkable loss. In 1999, organizers of the Kennedy Center Honors wanted to dedicate an entire night to Carson's influence on American culture. Washington, District of Columbia, black tie, a nationally televised tribute. He declined through his lawyer. I'm honored, but no. In 2002, the Mark Twain Prize Committee came calling. They considered him an obvious choice, a towering influence in American comedy. Once more, I'm honored, but no. By the early 2000s, something remarkable had happened. An entire generation of Americans was growing up having never seen Johnny Carson do anything contemporary. They knew him, if at all, from old clips, YouTube uploads, or their parents' stories. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Through it all, Carson never broke. No surprise walk-on during Letterman's monologue. No reunion with Ed McMahon on a daytime couch. No final goodbye special. He simply did not appear. That's reason 3 Johnny Carson vanished. A philosophical, almost religious commitment to being remembered at the peak, and only at the peak. But even that wasn't the whole story. Because by the late 1990s, there was another factor accelerating his disappearance. One he couldn't charm, negotiate, or outthink. His own body. The body breaking down. On his final Tonight Show in 1992, Johnny Carson looked almost ageless. 66, but carrying himself like a man 15 years younger. Trim, tanned, that quick, assessing glint still in his eyes. Viewers assumed he was retiring because he was ready, not because he had to. They were only half right. Behind the scenes, the bill for one lifelong habit had already started to come due. Johnny Carson was a chain smoker of the old school, not a casual a few cigarettes a day smoker, but a 4 packs a day machine. 80 cigarettes, every day, for decades. Backstage, in his office, in his car, on his boat, the smoke was constant. He once joked about it. His body wasn't laughing, By some estimates, across 50 years, he smoked over 1 million cigarettes. During his Tonight Show years, a small army helped hide the damage. Makeup artists softened lines and sallowness. Lighting technicians adjusted angles and warmth to flatter his face. Editors knew which shots to favor. On television, he still looked like Johnny. Off television, the toll showed. In March 1999, 7 years into retirement, it all caught up with him at once. Carson suffered a serious heart attack. Doctors rushed him into surgery for a quadruple bypass. The procedure is brutal. They split the breastbone, crack the chest open like a book, pull veins from the legs, and sew them into the heart as alternate pathways for blood. Carson was 73. The recovery was long, painful, and humbling. He'd built a public identity on ease and control. Now he struggled just to rebuild enough stamina to walk a block without stopping. He never returned to his old level of physical energy. Then, in 2002, came the final diagnosis: emphysema. Emphysema is a progressive lung disease, often caused by smoking, that slowly destroys the ability to breathe. Simple acts, walking across a room, getting dressed, talking at length, become exhausting. For a man whose persona was built on effortless conversation, the irony was brutal. Friends later described how Carson's world shrank physically as well as socially. Walking from his bedroom to his living room became a small expedition. He needed to plan his movements, pace his speech, rest between tasks. The man America remembered strolling onto stage, waving casually, ad-libbing with the band, now had to think about oxygen as a finite resource. Carson had always been meticulous about his public image. Now, that instinct became an iron rule. Under no circumstances would he allow himself to be photographed, filmed, or even casually glimpsed in this diminished state. So he disappeared further. His Malibu estate was already heavily guarded, with gates and staff who understood the value of privacy. Now, access tightened even more. Only the closest circle could visit. Even they were expected not to talk. When he wanted to escape entirely, he went to sea. His 130-foot yacht, the Serengeti, became a floating disappearance. Out on the Pacific, days from shore, there were no paparazzi, no stray fans with cameras, no accidental sightings at restaurants. There were just waves, sky, and a man who no longer had to perform. One of his assistants would later reveal that in his final months, Carson sometimes needed a wheelchair to move around the house. On bad days, even the small distance from his bedroom to his beloved terrace overlooking the ocean was too much. Yet no tabloid ever printed a photo of Johnny Carson in a wheelchair. No gossip site ever leaked a grainy hospital shot. No talk show host ever said, "I ran into Johnny, he's not looking good." Why? Because Carson built a wall, and everyone around him honored it. Friends didn't cash in on "my final visit with Johnny" stories. Staff didn't secretly call reporters, the code held. On January 23, 2005, Johnny Carson passed away from respiratory failure caused by emphysema. He was 79. For most Americans, the news came as a jolt, not just because he was gone, but because he had, in a sense, already been gone for 13 years. The last living image they had of him was still that 1992 farewell, standing straight, eyes bright, saying goodnight with total command of the room. His greatest trick in those final years was not just hiding his illness. It was freezing his public image at the peak of his power, ensuring that no camera would ever capture the gap between the myth and the man. That's reason 4. Johnny Carson vanished, a body quietly breaking down, and a man utterly unwilling to let the public witness his weakness. But even if his health had been perfect, something else was pushing him off stage, something bigger than any one performer. The entire media universe that created Johnny Carson was collapsing. Drop a comment. Which reason shocked you most? And which Hollywood legend should we investigate next? The end of everyone watching the same thing. Johnny Carson wasn't just a host. He was a product of a specific moment in American media history, a moment that is gone and never coming back. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Americans had almost no choice in what they watched. 3 networks, maybe a handful of local stations. That scarcity created something powerful, a shared cultural life. When a president spoke, when the moon landing happened, almost everyone saw the same thing at the same time. Johnny Carson became the nightly embodiment of that shared experience. His job wasn't just to entertain. It was to be a safe place where nearly all of America could show up together. And for 3 decades, The Tonight Show was the place where the country wound down together. By the time Carson retired in 1992, that world was disintegrating. Cable had exploded. Hundreds of channels: music television, cable news network, entertainment and sports programming network, home box office, niche networks for every taste and tribe. The old monoculture where Johnny could draw 10 million people by simply being there at 11:30 was shot through with cracks. The skills Johnny had perfected, broad appeal, light touch, the ability to speak to everyone, were starting to look outdated. It wasn't that he'd lost his fastball. The game had changed. Carson could see the early signs before most. He watched cable hosts build brands by diving deep into niche interests and partisan takes. He saw the national conversation splintering into 1,000 competing voices. He understood a brutal reality. The age of the universal host was ending. If he'd stayed, he would have eventually faced a choice. Either change himself, lean harder into politics, become more strident, more targeted, more endlessly available across every new platform, or watch his influence slowly bleed out as his audience splintered. For a man obsessed with the zenith, that was no choice at all. He chose to leave at the exact moment the old world still fit him, rather than linger into a new world that had no use for his style. By 2005, the year he passed away, late night had already become more partisan, more fragmented, more online. By 2015, the idea that one man could be a nightly shared experience for the entire country was essentially fantasy. Johnny Carson's disappearance wasn't just a personal decision. It was the symbolic end of an era when one entertainer could unify such a vast, diverse audience. That's reason 5 Johnny Carson vanished. The structural media changes that made his approach obsolete in a fractured, always-on, pick-your-tribe world. Even in his final rest, he maintained control. There was no televised funeral, no industry-wide memorial, no award show montage with cutaways to weeping stars. Carson had instructed his family and representatives, no public service. Hollywood never got its chance to line up and publicly mourn him on camera. There was no final chance to turn his departure into content. The only Johnny Carson that exists in the public imagination is the one he allowed, the man behind the desk, at the top of his game. The strategy worked. The legacy of strategic disappearance. Johnny Carson's vanishing act may be the most successful piece of image management in modern entertainment history. His reputation hasn't eroded, it has intensified. He's remembered as the gold standard of late night, a title he protected not by staying visible, but by refusing to appear. That's not accidental, it's architecture. Legends require distance. When a star becomes too accessible, too constantly present, you see the gaps, the off nights, the ordinary human moments. The magic leaks out. The more contemporary you are, the more temporary you become. Carson understood that to stay timeless, you have to step out of time. The 5 reasons he disappeared formed a perfect system. His extreme introversion, forged by Ruth Carson's coldness, gave him both the desire and the psychological capacity to walk away from universal adoration. The institutional betrayal by the National Broadcasting Company snapped his last professional loyalty. Once they showed him his opinion on his own legacy didn't matter, he owed them nothing. His zenith philosophy gave him a framework. You don't maintain legend by hanging around. You maintain it by knowing the exact moment to exit and sticking to it, no matter the temptation. His declining health made the choice, morally and aesthetically, non-negotiable. He would not let millions see the man behind the myth gasping for air. And the collapse of the broadcast era meant the very thing he did best, being a unifying force, was no longer structurally possible. The job he'd mastered no longer existed in the same form. Together, these forces turned a retirement into an erasure, and an erasure into a monument. Johnny Carson didn't just leave television. He left public existence. If this story changed how you remember Johnny Carson, from the friendly neighbor in the television set to a master strategist who controlled every frame of his legacy, please like this video and share it with someone who stayed up, watching him all those years. His story deserves to be remembered the way he wanted, at the peak of his power, before the world changed around him. By vanishing, Carson gave us a strange kind of gift, permission to remember him perfectly. We don't have to reconcile the image of the vigorous host with the reality of a frail man in a wheelchair. We don't have to watch him adjust to formats he didn't understand or stumble through jokes he no longer believed in. For 13 years, he resisted every lure to return. Ego, money, nostalgia, pressure. He never broke. His final and greatest performance wasn't a monologue, a sketch, or a guest's perfectly timed entrance. It was absence. Johnny Carson left this world on January 23, 2005, at 79, from respiratory failure due to emphysema. But the Johnny Carson we remember, the one with the sly smile, the perfect timing, the total command of the room, is immortal, preserved exactly as he intended, frozen at the zenith. Ruth Carson taught her son that his authentic self was unacceptable, that survival meant constructing a more palatable version of himself. Half a century later, Johnny Carson ensured the world would only ever know the performance and never fully understand the cost. By choosing to vanish, he did something almost no one in American entertainment ever manages. He became timeless. Subscribe to Golden Age Files for more untold histories of the legends you grew up watching. And let us know in the comments which moment of Carson's story stayed with you most, or which star you want us to investigate next.